The letter arrived on the coldest day Ruth Darnell had ever known in Arizona territory. Snow fell thick and heavy outside the boarding house window, turning the desert into something unrecognizable. Something that reminded her too much of the silence that had filled her life since Thomas died. She held the envelope between fingers still raw from endless stitching. Her trade was all she had left now, and even that barely kept her fed. The return address read simply, C. Madsen, Cross Hollow Ranch. She'd answered his advertisement in the Territorial Gazette 3 weeks prior, when desperation finally outweighed pride. Dear Mrs. Darnell. The letter began in careful, unpracticed script. Your letter of inquiry has been received. The position remains open. I require someone who can cook for 8 ranch hands, maintain the house, and perform general domestic duties. The pay is $20 monthly plus board, if these terms are agreeable. I will expect you on the 15th of February. The stage stops at Cross Hollow every Tuesday. Respectfully, Colt Madsen. Ruth read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her carpet bag alongside the few possessions she hadn't sold. $20 wasn't much, but it was honest work. Far from this place where every glance reminded her she was the widow of a gambler, a drunk, a man who'd left nothing behind but debts and whispers. The other boarders had stopped speaking to her weeks ago. Mrs. Holloway, who ran the establishment, had made it clear that Ruth's presence was becoming uncomfortable for the other ladies. The truth was simpler. Thomas had owed money to half the men in town, and now those debts had somehow become hers to bear in shame, if not in coin. She pulled her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders and began to pack. There wasn't much: 2 dresses, her sewing kit, a Bible that had been her grandmother's, and a small daguerreotype of her parents, long dead. The wedding ring she'd already sold to pay for Thomas's burial. The next morning, Ruth stood at the stage depot before dawn, snow still falling in thick curtains. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, looked at her single bag with surprise. Traveling light, ma'am. Yes, she didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. The journey took 3 days through weather that grew worse with each mile. The stage stopped twice, once at a way station where Ruth slept on a narrow cot in a room with 3 other women, all of whom eyed her worn dress with varying degrees of pity and suspicion, and once at a larger town where she used precious coins to buy hardtack and jerky. On the 3rd day, the snow finally ceased, revealing a landscape of red rock and scattered juniper beneath a shell of white. The beauty of it made Ruth's chest tight with something like hope. Cross Hollow, Pete called out as they descended into a valley where a small collection of buildings huddled against the wind. End of the line for you, ma'am. Ruth stepped down from the stage on unsteady legs, her bag clutched in both hands. The town was smaller than she'd imagined: a general store, a saloon, what looked like a sheriff's office, and a few other establishments she couldn't identify through the blowing snow. You the new cook for the Madsen place? Pete asked, handing down her bag. I am. He pointed west. Ranch is about 2 miles that way. Colt said he'd be waiting. Sure enough, a lone figure stood beside a wagon near the general store. Even from a distance, Ruth could see he was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked with their hands. He wore a long duster coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. As she approached, he straightened and touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Darnell. Yes. Colt Madsen. His voice was deep, roughened by weather or perhaps disuse. I've got supplies to load. Won't take but a few minutes. He didn't wait for her response. Simply took her bag and placed it carefully in the wagon bed before disappearing into the store. Ruth stood awkwardly beside the wagon, aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. A woman emerged from the millinery shop, took one look at Ruth, and hurried away. When Colt returned, his arms full of sacks and crates, Ruth moved to help. He shook his head. No need, ma'am. Almost done. She noticed then that he favored his left side, loading everything with careful movements that spoke of old pain. When he turned to grab the last crate, the wind caught his coat, and she glimpsed the edge of scarred skin along his neck before he adjusted his collar. The ride to the ranch was silent save for the creak of wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Colt drove with steady hands, his profile revealing a face that might have been handsome, if not for the weight it seemed to carry lines too deep for what she guessed were his 30-odd years. A mouth set in what looked like permanent wariness. "Storm's been bad," he said finally, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left town. "Worst in years. Lost some cattle." "I'm sorry." He glanced at her, seeming surprised by the response. "Part of ranching." The road wound through a canyon where the snow had drifted deep. Twice. Colt had to get down and clear the path. Each time. Ruth noticed how he kept his right side turned away from her, how his coat never quite fell open despite the exertion. As they crested a rise, the ranch came into view, a collection of buildings arranged around a main house that looked solid, if not fancy. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could see men moving between the barn and what must be the bunkhouse. "That's it," Colt said unnecessarily. "Your room's in the main house. Kitchen's well stocked. The men eat at 6 morning and evening. They're rough but respectful. Any trouble, you come to me." Ruth nodded, studying what would be her new home. It was isolated, windswept, and cold. It was also a place where no one knew about Thomas's gambling, his debts, or the way he'd died face down in an alley behind the Crimson Bell, shot by someone he'd cheated at cards. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Madsen," she said. He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and climbed down, moving to help her descend. For just a moment, as he reached up to steady her, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Loneliness, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Welcome to Cross Hollow Ranch, Mrs. Darnell," he said, and she heard in those simple words an echo of her own desperate hope for a place where the past couldn't follow. As she stood before the house, bag in hand and snow beginning to fall again, Ruth allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found such a place. The letter had promised shelter, and looking at the solid walls before her, the smoke rising warm against the gray sky, she thought perhaps it might offer more than that. She didn't know then about the nightmares that woke Colt Madsen screaming, about the fire that had taken more than just his flesh, or about the way the good people of Cross Hollow would look at her when they learned who she'd been married to. All she knew was that she was cold, tired, and grateful for the chance to start again. Colt carried her bag inside, showed her to a small but clean room, and left her with a quiet, "Supper's at 6. As his footsteps faded down the hall, Ruth unpacked her few possessions and tried not to think about how empty the house felt, how carefully Colt had kept his distance, or how the wind sounded almost like whispers through the walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that had brought her here, as if the desert itself was offering her the blank slate she so desperately needed. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cross Hollow's main street as Ruth stepped down from Colt's wagon for her first supply run. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at the ranch. 3 weeks of establishing routines and learning the preferences of 8 hungry cowboys. Now she needed flour, salt pork, and coffee, lots of coffee. The town looked different without snow, revealing itself to be exactly what she'd feared, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, large enough that there were social hierarchies and unspoken rules. Dust swirled where snow had been, coating everything in a fine red film that seemed to seep into the very pores of the wooden buildings. "I'll load the feed," Colt said, his voice carrying that same careful distance he'd maintained since her arrival. "Meet you back here in an hour." Ruth watched him walk toward the feed store, noticed again how he kept his right shoulder slightly turned, his coat collar high despite the warming weather. The ranch hands had been more forthcoming about their boss' careful comments about the fire 3 years past. Respectful mentions of his fairness, sideways glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The general store's bell chimed as she entered, and conversation stopped. 4 women stood near the fabric counter, their heads turning in unison like a flock of well-dressed birds. Ruth recognized the type merchants' wives, the social arbiters of small towns everywhere. "Good morning," she said, moving past them toward the grocery section. "You must be the new housekeeper at the Madsen Ranch." The speaker was a woman of middle years, her dress crisp despite the dust, her eyes sharp as broken glass. "I'm Mrs. Abigail Thornton. My husband owns the bank." Ruth Darnell. She didn't offer her hand, sensing it wouldn't be welcomed. Darnell. Another woman, younger but trying to appear older with an elaborate hairstyle, tested the name like she was tasting something foreign. From back east, most recently from Tucson. A meaningful look passed between the women. Ruth turned to the shelves, began selecting items with careful attention to prices. She could feel their eyes on her back, measuring the wear on her dress, the simple style of her hair, the absence of jewelry. Such a shame about poor Mr. Madsen. "Mrs. Thornton said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "That fire destroyed so much more than his barn. They say he used to be quite handsome." "Used to smile, too," the younger woman added. "Before." Ruth's hand stilled on a bag of beans, before she could decide whether to respond. The bell chimed again, and a man entered, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from either money or authority. The star on his vest suggested the latter. "Ladies." He touched his hat brim, but his eyes found Ruth immediately. "Don't believe we've met. Bill Morgan, Deputy Sheriff." Ruth Darnell. Something flickered in his expression. Darnell. Now, why does that name sound familiar? Ruth's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Common enough name, I expect." He studied her a moment longer, then smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Expect so. Welcome to Cross Hollow, Mrs. Darnell." The way he emphasized the Mrs. told her he knew exactly who she was, who Thomas had been. She turned back to her shopping, hands not quite steady as she reached for a tin of baking powder. When she'd gathered what she needed, Mr. Garrett, the store owner, tallied her purchases with professional detachment, but as he wrapped her goods in brown paper, he leaned forward slightly. "Colt Madsen's a good man," he said quietly. "Runs an honest operation. You'll do fine out there." It was the first kind word anyone in town had offered, and Ruth had to blink against unexpected moisture in her eyes. "Thank you." Outside, the sun had climbed higher, revealing Cross Hollow in unforgiving detail. Paint peeled from buildings, horses stood hip-shot at hitching posts, and men lounged in front of the saloon despite the early hour. Ruth noticed how their eyes followed her progress down the boardwalk, noticed too how quickly they looked away when she met their gazes. Colt was already at the wagon, loading sacks of grain with those same careful movements. When he saw her approach, he moved to take her packages, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the full extent of what the fire had done. The scarring ran from just below his right ear down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. The skin was tight, mottled pink and white, pulling slightly at the corner of his eye. He must have seen her looking because he turned away quickly, busying himself with securing her packages. "Get everything you need," his voice was gruff. "Yes." They drove in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. "Town treating you all right?" Ruth considered her words. "Well enough." He glanced at her, and she saw understanding in his expression. "They're not bad people, just careful with newcomers. And with their employer, it seems." His hands tightened on the reins. "They've got their reasons." The fire. Among other things. He was quiet for a long moment. "My wife was in the barn when it caught. I got her out, but—" He shrugged, the gesture saying more than words could. "She didn't survive. She did, for 2 days. His voice was flat, empty of emotion that had been worn away by repetition. Then she looked at what the fire had done to both of us and decided she couldn't live that way. Ruth didn't ask what he meant by decided. In the territories, there were some truths too hard for direct words. "I'm sorry," she said instead. 3 years ago. He shifted on the seat, adjusting his coat. "People remember, though. Remember her. Remember the fire. Remember how I used to be. Makes them uncomfortable. Change often does." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or recognition. That why you left Tucson people's discomfort. Ruth considered deflecting, but something about the afternoon sun and the honest pain in his voice made her speak truth. "My husband died owing money to half the town. They couldn't collect from a dead man, so they collected in other ways. Whispers, turned backs, suggestions that I might find other towns more welcoming. He gambled, among other things." Colt nodded slowly. "Well, Mrs. Darnell, I don't much care what you're running from as long as you can cook and keep house. Man's past or woman's is their own business." They drove the rest of the way in companionable silence, and Ruth found herself stealing glances at this scarred man who offered acceptance without questions. As they turned up the ranch road, he spoke again. "That deputy, Bill Morgan, he say anything particular to you?" "He recognized my name, my husband's name." "Morgan's got a long memory and a longer reach. But he's got no authority outside town limits, and I don't tolerate trouble on my land." He pulled the wagon up to the house. "You have any problems with him or anyone else? You tell me." Ruth climbed down from the wagon, smoothing her skirts. "Mr. Madsen, I didn't come here to bring trouble to your door." "No," he said, beginning to unload supplies. "I don't expect you did, but trouble has a way of finding people whether they invite it or not. Only question is whether you face it alone or with help." As he carried the grain sacks toward the barn, Ruth watched him go, this damaged man who offered protection without conditions, who understood the weight of unwanted history. She thought about Mrs. Thornton's sharp eyes, about Deputy Morgan's knowing smile, about the way conversation had stopped when she'd entered the store. Cross Hollow might not offer the blank slate she'd hoped for, but perhaps it offered something else, a place where scars, visible or hidden, didn't define your worth, where a woman could rebuild herself with flour and fabric and honest work, and where a man could offer shelter without demanding anything in return except a decent meal at the end of the day. She carried her packages inside, already planning the evening meal. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges it always did in small towns with long memories. But tonight, she would cook for men who judged her only by her biscuits, in a house where the past was acknowledged but not dwelt upon. For a man who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was simply let someone be. The scream tore through the night like a blade through silk. Ruth sat bolt upright in her narrow bed, heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she thought she'd dreamed it, then it came again, raw and desperate, from somewhere outside the main house. She fumbled for her shawl and slippers, not bothering to light a lamp. 2 months at the ranch had taught her to navigate in darkness, to move quietly through rooms that creaked their age with every step. The screaming had stopped, replaced by something worse, a low, keening sound like an animal in pain. The kitchen door opened silently under her practiced hand. Outside, the moon hung full and bright, turning the ranch yard into a landscape of silver and shadow. She could see the bunkhouse, dark and quiet, the hands either sleeping through the noise or choosing to ignore it. Then movement caught her eye. A figure near the small canvas tent pitched beside the horse barn. Colt. Ruth had wondered about that tent since her first week. Why would a man sleep outside when he owned a perfectly good house with empty bedrooms? The hands wouldn't speak of it directly, but she'd pieced together fragments. Colt hadn't slept in the main house since the fire, since Margaret. She approached slowly, her slippers silent on the packed earth. As she drew closer, she could hear him more clearly, not screaming now, but talking, pleading with someone who wasn't there. "I can't reach you. The beam. Margaret, please." He was on his knees beside the tent, hands clawing at the ground as if digging through invisible debris. Even in the moonlight, she could see the sweat soaking through his nightshirt, the way his whole body shook with the force of whatever nightmare held him. Ruth had seen Thomas in the grip of drink terrors often enough to know that waking someone in this state could be dangerous. Instead, she knelt a safe distance away and spoke softly. "Mr. Madsen, Colt, you're dreaming. You're safe." His movement stilled, though tremors still ran through his frame. "Margaret?" "No, it's Ruth, Mrs. Darnell." She kept her voice low, soothing. "You're at the ranch. There's no fire." Slowly, painfully, he seemed to surface from whatever hell had claimed him. His breathing was ragged, harsh in the quiet night. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were wild, unfocused. "Mrs. Darnell?" The confusion in his voice made him sound younger, vulnerable in a way daylight never allowed. "What are you—" "I heard you call out." She stayed where she was, hands visible, unthreatening. "Thought you might need help." He became aware then of his position kneeling in the dirt, nightshirt soaked with sweat, his scars visible in the cruel brightness of the moon. His hand went automatically to his collar, trying to cover what couldn't be hidden. "You should go back inside," he said, voice rough. "I'm fine." "No," Ruth said simply. "You're not." He stared at her, and she met his gaze steadily. After a long moment, his shoulders sagged. "It's always the same dream," he said, words coming slow and painful. "The fire, the barn. I can see her, but I can't." His hands clenched into fists. "The beam fell between us by the time I moved it, got to her." Ruth shifted closer, close enough to see the tears tracking down his face, mixing with sweat and dust. "You saved her." "For what 2 days of agony before she—" He cut himself off, shaking his head violently. "Before she made her choice," Ruth finished softly. His head snapped up. "Don't speak of what you don't understand." "I understand more than you think." Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. "My husband made his own choice. Whiskey and cards and a temper that got worse with every debt. The night he died, he'd been winning for once. One big off the wrong man. I begged him to come home, to walk away with something for once. He chose to stay for one more hand." The silence stretched between them, filled with cricket songs and distant coyote calls. "I dream about it too," she continued. "Different choices. What if I'd tried harder? What if I'd said different words? What if I'd gone to the saloon myself? Embarrassed him into leaving." She shook her head. "But they made their choices. All we can do is live with what's left." Colt wiped his face with the back of his hand, a gesture so unconsciously vulnerable it made her chest tight. "Is that what we're doing? Living? Trying to—" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not speak again. Then, "I can't sleep in the house. Haven't been able to since—" "The walls feel like they're closing in, like they're about to burst into flame." "So you sleep out here?" "When I sleep." He gestured toward the tent. "Most nights I just lie there, watching for smoke." Ruth made a decision then, one that surprised her even as the words left her mouth. "There's a cot in the kitchen pantry, from when the previous cook's boy was sick and she needed to tend him through the night. You could sleep there." He looked at her sharply. "In the house?" "In the kitchen. No walls to speak of. Plenty of windows and doors. You could see the sky if you needed to." "Mrs. Darnell, that's not proper—" She almost laughed. "Mr. Madsen, you're sleeping in a tent like a drifter while you own a perfectly good house. I'm a widow working as a housekeeper because no decent woman would hire me in Tucson. I think we're past proper." He studied her face in the moonlight, and she saw the moment his pride gave way to exhaustion. Just for tonight. If that's what you need to tell yourself. They walked back to the house together, Colt moving stiffly, like a man made of broken parts poorly mended. Ruth lit a lamp in the kitchen and showed him the small alcove where the cot was stored. Together, they set it up near the window that faced east, where dawn would find him first. I'll make coffee, she said, moving to the stove. You don't need to. Yes, I do. She busied herself with the familiar routine water, grounds, the careful tending of flame. I've spent enough sleepless nights to know that dawn comes easier with something warm in your hands. While the coffee brewed, she fetched a clean blanket from the linen cupboard, studiously ignoring how he sat on the cot's edge like he might bolt at any moment. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed, and he didn't pull away. Why? He asked suddenly. Why show kindness to a broken-down rancher who screams at ghosts? Ruth poured her own cup, considering. Because kindness costs nothing. Because you gave me a chance when no one else would. Because... She met his eyes. Because I know what it's like to feel like the fire never stops burning, even after the flames are gone. He set down his cup with trembling hands. Margaret used to say the scars didn't matter, right up until she swallowed the laudanum. Left a note saying she couldn't watch me suffer anymore, couldn't bear her own pain, as if dying was somehow kinder than staying. People tell themselves all kinds of lies when the pain gets too much, Ruth said quietly. Thomas convinced himself that the next hand would change everything, that the drinking helped him think clearer, that I was the reason he couldn't catch a break. She traced the rim of her cup. Maybe Margaret convinced herself she was sparing you something worse. She was sparing herself. The bitterness in his voice could have curdled milk. And I can't even blame her for it. Look at me. He gestured to his scarred side. Who would choose this? Ruth set down her cup, harder than necessary. You listen to me, Colt Madsen. You're a good man who runs an honest ranch and treats people fairly. You gave me work when you could have hired someone without baggage. You pay your hands on time and don't cheat your customers. So you've got scars. We've all got scars. Yours just show on the outside. He stared at her, something shifting in his expression. You really believe that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. The first hints of dawn were creeping through the window, painting the kitchen in soft grays and pinks. Colt lay back on the cot, exhaustion finally winning over vigilance. Sleep in my bed tonight, he said suddenly, voice slurred with approaching sleep, or I'll sleep on fire alone. Ruth frowned. What? But he was already drifting, the coffee cup tilting dangerously in his loose grip. She rescued it, set it on the table, and pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face softened, making him look younger despite the scars. She stood there a moment, watching this proud, broken man who'd finally accepted help, even if he'd had to frame it as something else. Through the window, she could see the ranch hands beginning to stir in the bunkhouse. Soon, they'd want breakfast, would wonder why their boss was sleeping in the kitchen. Let them wonder, Ruth thought. Some things were more important than gossip. As she began preparing biscuits for the morning meal, she found herself humming something she hadn't done since before Thomas's debts had started mounting. The kitchen felt different with another person in it, warmer somehow, as if Colt's presence had chased away shadows she hadn't known were there. He slept through breakfast preparation, through the hands, curious glances, through the morning coffee and conversation. It was the first real sleep he'd had in 3 years. There in a kitchen that smelled of biscuits and bacon, with a woman standing guard against his demons without making a fuss about it. And if Ruth worked a little more quietly than usual, if she shooed the hands out quickly when they finished eating, if she kept the coffee warm for when he woke well, that was just basic kindness. Wasn't it? The whispers started small, like smoke curling from a poorly tended fire. Ruth noticed them first at the general store conversations that stopped when she entered, eyes that followed her movements with newfound interest. 3 weeks had passed since Colt began sleeping in the kitchen, and Cross Hollow had taken notice. "Scandalous," she heard Mrs. Thornton hiss to her circle as Ruth selected fabric for new kitchen curtains. A widow and a widower under the same roof, and him sleeping in the kitchen like a common farmhand. What else goes on in that house at night? Ruth kept her hands steady as she examined a bolt of blue calico. Though heat crept up her neck, she'd known this would come. Had tried to warn Colt, but he'd brushed off her concerns with characteristic stubbornness. Let them talk. He'd said, "I haven't slept through a full night in 3 years. I won't give that up for their gossip." Now, standing in the store with the judgment pressing against her back like a physical weight, Ruth wondered if either of them had truly understood the cost. She paid for her purchases and left, head high despite the whispers that followed her out. On the boardwalk, she nearly collided with Deputy Morgan, who seemed to materialize from the shadows between buildings. "Mrs. Darnell." He touched his hat brim, that same knowing smile playing at his lips. "How fortuitous. I've been meaning to speak with you." "Deputy." She moved to step around him, but he shifted, blocking her path without quite seeming to. "I've been doing some checking about your late husband." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Interesting reading. Seems Thomas Darnell owed money to quite a few people in Tucson, including one Samuel Morrison." Ruth's blood chilled. Sam Morrison, the man who'd killed Thomas, who'd been acquitted on grounds of self-defense when Thomas had pulled a knife during their confrontation. "That's old history, Deputy." "Is it?" Morgan's eyes glinted. "See, Sam Morrison is my cousin. Writes me letters sometimes. Says there was talk in Tucson about Thomas Darnell's widow. How she might have known about that knife. How she might have wanted her husband gone as much as anyone." "That's a lie." The words came out sharper than intended. "Maybe so, but lies have a way of growing legs in small towns, especially when folks are already inclined to think poorly of someone." He leaned closer, and she could smell tobacco on his breath. "Now, I might be persuaded to keep Sam's letters to myself, assuming you were to reconsider your living situation." Ruth understood then. This wasn't about morality or proper behavior. This was about power, about a man who wanted to control what he couldn't have. "Are you threatening me?" Deputy, offering friendly advice. He stepped back, that false smile widening. "A woman in your position needs to be careful about appearances. Wouldn't want folks to get the wrong idea about what kind of person you are." He touched his hat again and sauntered away, leaving Ruth standing on the boardwalk with shaking hands and rising anger. She made it back to the ranch without remembering the journey, her mind churning with implications and impossibilities. Colt was in the barn when she arrived, working with a young horse. He took one look at her face and handed the lead rope to Jake, his foreman. "What happened?" She told him, words tumbling over each other in her urgency to get them out. His expression darkened with each sentence, the muscle in his jaw tightening until she thought it might snap. "That son of a—" He cut himself off, hands clenching. Morgan's had his eye on this ranch for years. Thought when Margaret died, He shook his head. "He figured I'd move on. When I didn't, he started looking for other ways." "This isn't about the ranch. It's about me. My presence here is giving him ammunition. Your presence here is none of his damned business." Colt's vehemence surprised them both. He moderated his tone, though the anger remained. "You've done nothing wrong." "Since when has that mattered?" Ruth wrapped her arms around herself. "He'll spread those lies. People already talk about us, about the impropriety of our arrangement, add murder suspicions to that." "You didn't kill your husband." "No, I just wished him dead every night when he came home reeking of whiskey and other women's perfume. I just felt relief when they told me he was gone." The confession tore from her throat. "What kind of woman does that make me?" Colt stepped closer, and for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't turn his scarred side away. "A human one. You think I didn't feel relief when Margaret finally stopped suffering. You think I don't hate myself for that relief. They stood in the barn's filtered light, two damaged people carrying guilt for feelings they couldn't help. Finally, Ruth straightened her shoulders. I should leave, find work elsewhere. Without me here, Morgan has no leverage. No. The word came out flat, final. Colt ran a hand through his hair, disturbing the careful way he usually combed it to cover the worst of the scars. I won't be driven off my own land, and I won't let him drive off the first person in 3 years who's made this place feel like something more than a tomb. He met her eyes. Unless you want to leave, I'd understand if you did. Ruth thought about the kitchen at dawn. Coffee brewing while Colt slept peacefully on his cot. The way the ranch hands had started smiling more, joking over meals. How the house had begun to feel like a home rather than just a place to work. I don't want to leave. Then you won't. He turned toward the house. Come on, we need to go to town. What? Why? To face this head on. Morgan thinks he can skulk in shadows, spreading poison, time to bring it into the light. Within an hour, they were on the wagon heading for Cross Hollow. Colt had changed into his best shirt, the black one that minimized his scars, and Ruth had put on her better dress, the purple one she'd been saving. They made quite a picture walking down Main Street together, the scarred rancher and the widow with a questionable past. Colt didn't offer his arm, but he walked close enough that their message was clear, united front. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Patterson, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness, listened to their complaint about his deputy with growing concern. Bill's always been ambitious, Patterson said slowly, but this, making threats, spreading rumors, that crosses a line. He wants Mrs. Darnell to leave my employ, Colt said bluntly, using lies about her husband's death as leverage. Patterson's eyes sharpened. That's so well. I'll be having a word with Deputy Morgan. Man's got no business threatening decent folk, whatever his personal opinions might be. Their next stop was the general store, where the afternoon gossip circle was in full swing. Conversation died as they entered. Mrs. Thornton's mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Ladies, Colt said, touching his hat. Fine afternoon, isn't it, Mrs.? Darnell needed some supplies, and I thought I'd escort her. Been hearing there's some unsavory talk going around town. He let his gaze rest on each woman in turn, his scarred face set in lines that brooked no nonsense. I run an honest ranch, and Mrs. Darnell keeps an honest house. Anyone suggesting otherwise might find themselves explaining their slander to Sheriff Patterson, or to me directly. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable, one by one. The women found reasons to elsewhere fabric to examine, shopping to complete, urgent business that called them away. Only Mrs. Thornton remained, her face flushed with indignation. Mr. Madsen, surely you understand that people will talk when a man and woman share a house without benefit of... Without benefit of what, Mrs. Thornton? Ruth interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. Marriage. You're right. We're not married. We're employer and employee. Nothing more. If that arrangement troubles you, perhaps you should examine why your mind goes to improper places so readily. Mrs. Thornton's mouth snapped shut, her face going from red to white and back again. She gathered her skirts and swept from the store, dignity intact but authority challenged. Mr. Garrett, who'd been pretending to arrange canned goods, cleared his throat. About time someone stood up to that magpie. What can I get for you folks? They completed their shopping in peace, and if Mr. Garrett threw in an extra pound of coffee beans free of charge, well, that was just good business. As they loaded the wagon, Ruth saw Deputy Morgan watching from the saloon entrance. Colt saw him too, and did something that surprised her. He smiled, not the grimace that usually passed for his smiles, but a real one, transformative despite the scars. Let him watch, Colt said. Let them all watch. We've got nothing to hide. On the ride home, Ruth felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of bonds she hadn't realized were there. That was either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Colt's smile had faded, but something of its warmth remained. But I'm tired of letting fear dictate how I live. The fire took enough. It doesn't get to take my choices, too. That night, as she prepared dinner and Colt tended to evening chores, Ruth thought about choices, about Thomas choosing cards over safety, about Margaret choosing escape over endurance, about all the small choices that led people to joy or sorrow, connection or isolation. When Colt came in for dinner, she'd set 2 places at the main table instead of leaving his plate in the kitchen as usual. "Thought we might as well give them something real to talk about," she said, attempting lightness. He stood in the doorway, looking at the table set for 2, at the woman who'd stood beside him against the town's judgment. "You sure?" "I'm sure that I'm tired of letting other people's opinions matter more than our own comfort." She gestured to the chair. "Sit. Your food's getting cold." They ate together for the first time, conversation tentative but real. And if the hands noticed the change when they came for their evening coffee, they wisely kept their observations to themselves. Outside, night fell over Cross Hollow, bringing with it new rumors and speculation. But inside the ranch house, 2 people who'd thought themselves beyond redemption shared a quiet meal, finding in each other's company something neither had dared hope for the beginning of peace. The old grain storage building stood empty at the corner of the ranch property, weathered boards silver gray in the morning sun. Ruth walked around it slowly, envisioning possibilities where others might see only decay. The roof needed patching. True, and the door hung crooked on its hinges, but the bones were solid. "You're sure about this?" Colt stood in the doorway, doubt evident in his voice. "It's just been sitting empty since we built the new storage closer to the barn." "I'm sure." Ruth ran her hand along a wall beam, testing its strength. With some work, it could be perfect. Good light from those windows, enough space for a proper work area, and close enough to the house but separate. Professional. It had been her idea, born from necessity and nurtured by hope. Word of her skill with needle and thread had somehow spread despite, or perhaps because of the recent confrontation in town. Jake's wife had asked her to mend a torn Sunday dress. One of the neighboring ranchers had brought shirts that needed new collars. Even some of the town women, the ones who valued good work over gossip, had made tentative inquiries. "I can't keep taking in work without a proper space," Ruth continued. "The kitchen table isn't suitable for cutting fabric, and having people come to the house." She didn't need to finish. They both knew that having townspeople in the main house would only fuel more speculation. Colt moved into the space, his footsteps stirring small clouds of dust. "What would you need?" "Shelving for fabric, a good cutting table tall enough so I don't have to stoop, hooks for hanging completed work, better lighting, maybe a coal stove for winter." She turned to face him. "I have some money saved. I could pay for the materials." "No." The refusal came quick and firm. "You're improving my property. I'll cover the costs. But this is for my business." "Our business," he corrected, then seemed to realize what he'd said. "That is, you're doing this work while in my employ. Brings in extra income. Keeps you here instead of looking for work elsewhere. Makes good business sense." Ruth studied his face, noting the careful way he avoided her eyes. Since their stand in town 2 weeks prior, something had shifted between them. Not anything improper, they maintained careful boundaries, but an awareness, a consideration for each other that went beyond employer and employee. "All right," she agreed, "but I insist on splitting any profits with the ranch." "We'll discuss it when there are profits to split." The work began the next day. Colt surprised her by taking personal charge of the renovation, working alongside Jake and the other hands during their off hours. Ruth watched from the kitchen window as he measured and cut boards, his movements careful but competent despite his injuries. "Never seen the boss take such interest in a building project." Stella remarked. Jake's wife had come to collect her mended dress and stayed for coffee. Course, never seen him take such interest in much of anything these past 3 years. Ruth kept her attention on the coffee pot. He's been very generous. Stella's tone suggested she saw more than Ruth was saying. My Jake says, Mr. Madsen's been different lately. Sleeping better, eating regular meals. Even heard him humming the other day. I'm glad he's doing well. Stella laughed, not unkindly. Honey, we're all glad. That man's been walking around like a ghost since the fire. Nice to see him among the living again. She paused, then added more quietly. Nice to see you looking less haunted, too. Ruth's hand stilled on the coffee pot. She hadn't realized her own transformation was so visible. But Stella was right somewhere in the past months. The weight of Thomas's legacy had begun to lift. She no longer flinched when people mentioned Tucson, no longer felt the need to justify her presence with every breath. It's a good place, she said finally. The ranch. Good people. Good people make all the difference, Stella agreed. As the renovation progressed, word spread through the territory's mysterious networks of communication. By the time Ruth hung her simple sign, Ruth's Stitch and Shelter Practical Garments and Honest Repairs, she already had a week's worth of work lined up. The first official customer was unexpected Mrs. Garrett, the store owner's wife, carrying an armload of her husband's shirts. These need new cuffs, she announced, then lowered her voice. And I wanted to apologize for listening to gossip, for judging without knowing. She glanced around the neat space, taking in the bolts of fabric arranged by color, the orderly workspace, the professional atmosphere. My husband told me how you stood up to Abigail Thornton. About time someone did. After that, others came. Not the social arbiters like Mrs. Thornton, but the working women, the practical ones who valued skill over scandal. Ruth mended and altered. Created simple dresses for ranch wives who rarely had new things. Reinforced work clothes for men who paid in advance and said little but, "Thank you, ma'am." She developed a routine mornings in the main house preparing meals, afternoons in her shop, evenings back in the kitchen for supper. Colt had taken to working on ranch accounts at the kitchen table while she cooked. A comfortable silence between them, broken only by questions about supplies or comments about the day's work. You'll need help soon, he observed one evening, watching her work on a particularly intricate piece of embroidery by lamplight. Too much work for one person. Perhaps, but I'd have to be careful who I hired. Not everyone would be willing to work for... She hesitated. For the scandal-ridden widow working for the scarred rancher. His tone was wry rather than bitter. Something like that. He set down his pen, studying her across the table. Do you regret it coming here? No. The answer came without hesitation. Do you regret hiring me? Only thing I regret is that it took me 3 years to realize this house needed life in it again. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Ruth bent back to her embroidery, but her hands weren't quite steady. A week later, she found an addition to her shop when she arrived in the morning, a new rocking chair positioned near the window. Perfect for detailed handwork. Thought you might need it, Colt said when she thanked him, not quite meeting her eyes. All that standing and bending can't be good for your back. Small kindnesses accumulated like that the chair. Fresh flowers from his garden on her cutting table. A new lamp with a broader base for better light distribution. In return, Ruth found herself taking extra care with his meals, mending his clothes with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, ensuring his favorite coffee was always ready when nightmares drove him to early rising. The shop became a refuge not just for Ruth, but for others. Young wives came seeking advice on more than hemlines. Older women shared gossip and wisdom in equal measure. Even some of the Mexican women from the outskirts of town ventured in, initially hesitant but warming when Ruth greeted them in the Spanish she'd learned in Tucson. You're building something, Colt said one afternoon, finding her organizing fabric remnants to give to families who couldn't afford new cloth. More than just a business. We all need somewhere to belong, Ruth replied, thinking of her own journey from disgraced widow to respected craftswoman. Sometimes we just need someone to make space for us. He was quiet for a moment, then said, Margaret used to sew. Not well, she'd laugh about her crooked seams, but she tried. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without pain tightening his features. She would have liked this, seeing the old storage put to good use, seeing women gathering together. What else would she have liked? Ruth asked gently. A small smile crossed his face. Flowers. She loved flowers. Tried to grow roses here, but the climate fought her every step. Never gave up, though. Every spring, she'd try again. That evening, Ruth found herself studying seed catalogs, looking for varieties that might survive in the harsh territory. Not roses that would be too presumptuous, but something beautiful and stubborn enough to take root where it wasn't expected to flourish. Like her, like them. When she looked up, Colt was watching her from across the kitchen table. And in his eyes she saw recognition of all the things they weren't saying, all the possibilities they weren't quite ready to name. But for now, this was enough a quiet evening, useful work, and the knowledge that they'd each found something they'd thought lost forever, a place to heal. The purple dress hung in Ruth's small closet for weeks before she found the courage to wear it. She'd sewn it during quiet evenings, working by lamplight after the day's chores were done. The fabric was nothing fancy, good cotton from the general store, but she'd embroidered silver threads along the collar and cuffs, tiny flowers and vines that caught the light when she moved. That's beautiful work, Stella had said when she'd seen it in progress. Special occasion. The harvest festival. Ruth had admitted, then quickly added, I thought I should look presentable if I'm to drum up business for the shop. Stella's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled, but she'd said only, I'm sure you'll look lovely. Now, the night of the festival. Ruth stood before her small mirror and wondered if she'd been foolish to make such an effort. It was just a town dance. After all, she'd likely spend the evening serving punch and watching others enjoy themselves, as widows typically did at such gatherings. A knock at her door interrupted her doubts. Mrs. Darnell? Colt's voice, unusually hesitant. The wagon's ready when you are. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, and for a moment neither spoke. He wore a black suit she'd never seen before, well cut enough to minimize the way he favored his injured side. His hair was carefully combed, and he'd shaved with extra care. But what struck her most was the way he looked at her like a man seeing sunrise after a long night. You, he cleared his throat, started again. That's a fine dress. Thank you. You look very handsome yourself. The compliment seemed to startle him. His hand went automatically to his scarred side, then dropped. Shall we go? The ride to town was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to exist in the same space without need for constant words. The festival preparations had transformed Cross Hollow's main street. Lanterns hung from every post and beam, casting warm golden light over tables laden with food. A wooden platform had been erected for dancing, and already the sound of fiddle music filled the air. Ruth noticed the looks as they arrived, some curious, some disapproving, but more accepting than she'd expected. Their public confrontation with the gossips had shifted something in the town's perception. Or perhaps it was simply that time had worn down the sharpest edges of scandal. Ruth, Mary Patterson, the sheriff's wife, approached with a warm smile. How lovely you look. And Colt, it's good to see you at a social gathering again. They made their way through the crowd, Colt's hand hovering near Ruth's elbow. Not quite touching, but ready to steady her if needed. She was introduced to people she'd only known by reputation, found herself drawn into conversations about her shop, about the innovative patterns she'd been developing for riding skirts that allowed women more freedom of movement. I'll fetch us some punch, Colt said after a while, and Ruth watched him navigate the crowd, noting how people stepped aside to let him pass not from fear. She realized but from respect. "He's different," a voice said beside her. She turned to find Dr. Hawkins, the town physician who'd tended Colt after the fire. "Haven't seen him this present in years." Before Ruth could respond, the music changed to a waltz, and couples began moving onto the dance floor. She watched them with a mixture of longing and resignation. It had been years since she'd danced, even before Thomas's death. He'd considered such things frivolous, a waste of time better spent at card tables. Colt returned with 2 cups of punch, handing her one carefully. They stood at the edge of the gathering, watching others spin and sway in the lantern light. "Do you dance?" he asked suddenly. "I used to, before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing her widowhood, her fall from grace, all the reasons she stood on the margins now. "I used to as well, before." His gesture was more specific, indicating his injured side. "Margaret loved to dance. I was never much good at it, but I tried for her sake." The waltz ended, replaced by a slower tune. Around them, the crowd seemed to fade as they stood in their bubble of shared understanding. Then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, Colt set down his cup and extended his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance, Mrs. Darnell?" She saw the courage it took for him to ask. Saw, too, the eyes turning their way, the whispers that would surely follow, and found she didn't care. "I would be delighted, Mr. Madsen." She placed her hand in his, let him lead her onto the floor. His right hand settled carefully at her waist, mindful of propriety, while her left hand rested on his shoulder, the injured one. She realized, but he didn't flinch or pull away. They moved tentatively at first, finding their rhythm. He was cautious, clearly favoring his burned side, but his lead was steady and sure. Ruth had forgotten the simple pleasure of moving to music, of being guided across a floor by someone who knew the steps. "People are staring," she murmured. "Let them." His voice was low, meant only for her. "I'm tired of letting their opinions matter more than—" He trailed off, but his hand at her waist pressed slightly, completing the thought without words. They danced through one song, then another when he didn't release her. By the third, other couples had joined them on the floor, and if Ruth and Colt remained the subject of attention, it was less sharp, more wondering than condemning. "You're smiling," Colt observed, and Ruth realized it was true. "So are you," she countered, and was rewarded with a quiet laugh. "I suppose I am. First time in a long while I've had reason to." The music slowed, signaling the end of the set. Colt led her off the floor, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. They were immediately surrounded by well-wishers, some genuine, some merely curious, but Ruth found she could face them with equanimity now. "That was brave," Mary Patterson whispered when she had a moment. "Both of you. This town needs to see that life goes on after loss, that people can find happiness again." As the evening progressed, Ruth danced with others. Sheriff Patterson, Dr. Hawkins, even young Jake, who stumbled through a reel with enthusiasm if not skill. But she was aware always of where Colt stood, usually in conversation with ranchers and townsmen, but his eyes finding her regularly across the crowded space. Deputy Morgan made an appearance late in the evening, his face dark as he surveyed the scene. Ruth tensed when he approached, but Sheriff Patterson intercepted him, drawing him aside for what appeared to be a stern conversation. When Morgan left shortly after, his departure seemed final somehow, a threat neutralized by community solidarity. "One more dance." Colt appeared at her elbow as the evening wound down. "They're playing the last waltz." This time when they took the floor, it felt different. The nervous energy had settled into something warmer, deeper. Ruth was conscious of every point of contact between them, of the way he'd relaxed enough to hold her properly, of how right it felt to move together through space. "Thank you," she said as the music faded. For what? For asking me to dance, for making me feel like I belonged here tonight. He looked down at her, and in the lantern light she could see past the scars to the man beneath, good, kind, wounded but healing. You do belong here, he said simply, more than you know. The ride home was quiet again, but charged with new awareness. When they reached the ranch, Colt helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. Ruth, he began, then seemed to lose his words. I know, she said softly. We don't have to name it yet, but I know. He nodded, relief and something deeper flooding his features. I'll see you at breakfast. Always. She went inside, changed out of her purple dress with careful hands, hanging it back in the closet. But this time it didn't feel like putting away something unused. It felt like a promise of more evenings to come, more dances, more moments when two damaged souls could find grace in each other's arms. From her window, she could see Colt's lamp burning in the kitchen where he still slept, though less from fear now and more from habit. Soon, perhaps, he'd trust the house enough to claim a proper bedroom again. Soon, perhaps, they'd both trust happiness enough to reach for it with both hands. But tonight had been enough. Tonight, they danced in full view of the town, declaring themselves through movement, if not words. Tonight, they'd been neither the scarred rancher nor the disgraced widow, but simply Colt and Ruth, finding their way back to the land of the living, one careful step at a time. The smell hit them first, acrid smoke carried on the wind that had been gusting all day. Ruth was in her shop, pinning a hem for the minister's wife, when she heard the bell ringing from the ranch house. 3 sharp peals, then 3 more. The emergency signal. She dropped everything and ran, her customer forgotten. Outside, she could see it, a wall of smoke rising from the western pasture, orange flames visible even in the afternoon sun. The wildfire they'd all feared during this dry autumn had finally come. Get to the house, Jake was shouting, already mounted and riding hard toward the danger. Gather all the wet blankets you can find. Ruth ran for the kitchen where Colt was already moving, his face set in grim lines. For a moment, she saw naked fear in his eyes, the kind of terror that came from experience, from knowing exactly what fire could take. The cattle, he said, voice rough. If it reaches the south pasture, what do you need me to do? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw him push down the fear through sheer force of will. Soak every blanket, every piece of cloth you can find. Set up a station by the well. The men will need them for beating back the flames. And Ruth, he paused at the door. If it gets too close, you take the horses from the barn and ride for town. Promise me. Colt. Promise me. I promise. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. She wouldn't leave, not while he and the others fought to save everything they'd worked for. The next hours blurred together in smoke and sweat and controlled chaos. Ruth worked with mechanical efficiency, soaking blankets, hauling water, tending to men who staggered back coughing and singed. The minister's wife, bless her, stayed to help. And soon other women from town arrived, word spreading as fast as the fire itself. Where's Mr. Madsen? Stella asked, her face smudged with soot as she helped Ruth ready another batch of wet cloths. Ruth pointed toward the smoke. Leading the firebreak crew? Of course he was, despite his old injuries, despite the nightmares that still woke him screaming about burning barns. Colt had ridden straight toward his greatest fear. The fire crowned in the trees along the creek, sending embers flying like deadly fireflies. Ruth organized the women into a bucket brigade, wetting down the roofs of the nearer buildings. Her dress was soaked, her hands raw, but she kept moving. Then she saw something that made her heart stop. Flames had jumped the firebreak, were racing toward the barn where the milk cows and their calves were penned. Without thinking, Ruth grabbed a wet blanket and ran. The smoke was thicker here, making her eyes stream, her lungs burn. She could hear the cattle bellowing in fear, throwing themselves against the fence rails. The gate latch was hot to the touch, but she managed to work it open. The cows needed no encouragement, streaming out in a panic toward the open ground. But the calves, terrified and confused, huddled in the corner. "Come on," Ruth waded in among them, using the blanket to guide them toward the gate. One by one they bolted through, until only the smallest remained, a heifer calf that Jake's daughter had bottle raised, too terrified to move. The fire was close now, so close she could feel its heat like a living thing. Ruth threw the wet blanket over the calf and herself, lifting the animal with strength born of desperation. She staggered toward the gate as burning debris began falling around them. She almost made it. A burning beam from the barn's overhang crashed down, missing her by inches but blocking the gate. The calf bawled in terror, struggling in her arms. Ruth looked around wildly for another exit, but walls of flame surrounded them on 3 sides. Then strong hands were pulling the beam aside, and Colt was there, his face terrible in the firelight. "Give her to me!" Together they got the calf through the gate, Ruth stumbling after. Colt caught her as her knees buckled, half carrying, half dragging her away from the inferno that had once been the barn. "You promised me," he said roughly, setting her down a safe distance away. "You promised you'd leave." "I lied," she gasped out between coughs. For a moment, his hands framed her face, checking for burns, for injuries. Then he pulled her against him, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Don't ever," his voice broke. "I can't lose anyone else to fire. I can't." She could feel him trembling, the memories and the present danger tangling together. "I'm all right. We're all right." A shout from Jake broke them apart. The wind was shifting, pushing the fire back on itself. What had seemed like disaster might become salvation if they could hold the new line. "I have to go," Colt said. "I know. Be careful." He kissed her forehead quick, desperate, and was gone, back into the smoke and chaos. The battle raged through the night. Ruth lost track of time, lost track of everything but the next bucket of water, the next wet blanket, the next exhausted man who needed tending. At some point, Dr. Hawkins arrived, setting up a makeshift medical station. Burns were cleaned and wrapped. Smoke-seared lungs eased with steam treatments. Dawn came gray and bitter, revealing a landscape of char and destruction. But the ranch house stood. The new barn stood. Most of the cattle had survived. They had won, if such a thing could be called winning. Ruth found Colt sitting on the ground near what had been the old barn, staring at the smoking ruins. His shirt was burned through in places, his hands wrapped in makeshift bandages. 60 head lost, he said without looking up. "The barn, half the winter feed, could have been worse." She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Could have been much worse. When I saw you in there, with the fire," he shuddered. For a moment, it was happening all over again. Margaret in the flames, me too slow, too weak to save her. But you weren't too slow this time. You saved me. He turned to look at her then, and she saw tracks through the soot on his face where tears had fallen. "You saved those calves? Risked your life for animals most would write off as losses. Jake's daughter loves that little heifer. I couldn't let her burn." "No," he said softly. "You couldn't. It's who you are, someone who saves things others abandon." His bandaged hand found hers. "You saved me too, from giving up, from letting the fire win even after it was out." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full extent of the damage. Men moved wearily through the devastation, already beginning the work of cleanup and salvage. The women from town organized food for the workers, their presence a reminder that Cross Hollow had rallied to their aid. "We'll rebuild," Ruth said. "Yes. Together." He squeezed her hand, careful of both their injuries. "Together." Sheriff Patterson approached, his clothes as soot-stained as everyone else's. "Hell of a fight. Colt, Your quick action saved half the valley from burning. Everyone helped. Colt said, True enough, but it takes a leader to organize help into action. The sheriff's gaze included Ruth. And it takes brave people to run toward danger instead of away from it. Town won't forget what you both did today. After he left, Dr. Hawkins insisted on properly treating their burns and scrapes. Ruth's arms were blistered from the heat, her lungs raw from smoke, but nothing that wouldn't heal. Colt's injuries were worse new burns overlaying old scars, but he bore the treatment with stoic patience. You'll need to keep those bandages changed regular, the doctor instructed, and no heavy work for at least a week. I'll make sure he follows orders, Ruth said, ignoring Colt's grimace. As the day wore on, the full impact of the community's response became clear. Ranchers arrived with hay to replace what was lost. Timber was promised for rebuilding. The church ladies organized a fund drive, even Mrs. Thornton appeared with a wagon load of preserves and a grudging nod of respect. That evening, Ruth stood at the kitchen window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades that no longer reminded her only of flame. Colt stood beside her, his bandaged hand resting lightly on her shoulder. We survived, she said. More than survived. His voice was thoughtful. For 3 years, I've been so afraid of fire that I let it rule my life. Slept outside rather than face walls that might burn. Kept people at distance rather than risk losing them. He turned her to face him. Today I ran straight into my worst nightmare, and I survived it. We survived it. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm tired of letting fear decide my life. I'm saying that some things are worth the risk of loss. His hand cupped her face gently. I'm saying that I love you, Ruth Darnell, and I'm not going to waste any more time being afraid of that. The words hung between them, precious and terrifying and absolutely true. I love you too, she whispered. Despite all the reasons I shouldn't, despite everything that says it's too soon or too complicated or too... He kissed her then, cutting off her litany of doubts. It was gentle, mindful of their smoke-raw lips and the exhaustion they both carried. But it was also a promise, a claim, a declaration that some things could rise from ashes stronger than before. When they finally pulled apart, the kitchen was dark except for the last rays of sunlight slanting through the window. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of rebuilding, the challenge of moving forward from devastation. But tonight, 2 survivors stood together in the gathering dusk, no longer alone in their fears or their hopes. The fire had taken much, but it had also given them the knowledge that they were strong enough to face the flames, and that they no longer had to face them alone. The old grain storage building had been transformed into a makeshift infirmary, and Ruth had spent 3 days watching Colt slip further away from her. Dr. Hawkins had done what he could, but the new burns layered over old scars had become infected, and fever now ravaged his body with the same mercilessness as the fire itself. His body's been through too much, the doctor had said quietly that morning, his face grave. Between the old injuries and these new ones, I've seen stronger men succumb to less. Ruth had nodded, maintaining her composure until the doctor left. Then she'd returned to Colt's bedside, taking up her vigil with the same determination she'd brought to fighting the fire. He lay still now, too still, his breathing shallow and labored. The bandages covering his chest and arms needed changing again, but Ruth was afraid to disturb what little rest he found. Instead, she wrung out another cool cloth and laid it across his burning forehead. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice fierce despite its softness. "Don't you dare leave me now. Colt Madsen. Not after everything we've survived." His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for 2 days, sometimes calling for Margaret, sometimes for Ruth, often for people she didn't know, fellow soldiers from the war, perhaps, or childhood friends lost to time. Jake appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "How is he, ma'am?" "Fighting," Ruth said simply. It was the only word that seemed to fit. The men want you to know we've got everything handled. The new barn's coming along. Temporary shelters are up for the stock. You don't need to worry about nothing but him." Ruth managed a grateful smile. "Thank you. Jake, he'd be proud to know the ranch is in good hands." "Ranch don't mean nothing without the boss." Jake said gruffly, "You tell him that when he wakes up. You tell him we need him to get better." After Jake left, Ruth found herself talking to fill the silence, to keep Colt anchored to this world with the sound of her voice. "The wildflowers I planted are starting to sprout," she told him. "Desert marigolds and fairy dusters, hardy things that bloom after fires. I thought they'd be appropriate. Beauty from ashes." No response except the labored rise and fall of his chest. Mrs. Patterson brought more food today. I swear the entire town has decided we need feeding. Even Mrs. Thornton sent a pot of soup, though she had young Timothy deliver it rather than come herself. I suppose that's progress of a sort." She dipped the cloth in cool water again, gently bathing his face and neck. The scars stood out starkly against his fever-flushed skin, a map of all he'd endured. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night I found you by your tent?" she continued. "You said, 'Sleep in my bed tonight, or I'll sleep on fire alone.' I didn't understand then, but I do now. You were so tired of burning by yourself, of carrying all that pain with no one to share it." Her voice broke slightly. "Well, I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere, so you can't either. You can't leave me to face all this alone. That's not fair, and I won't allow it." Night fell, and still the fever raged. Ruth lit lanterns, changed his bandages with practiced hands, spooned water between his cracked lips when she could. Stella came to relieve her, but Ruth refused to leave. "I left Thomas alone when he was dying," she said, the confession torn from exhaustion and fear. "I was so angry with him, so tired of the drinking and the gambling and the broken promises. When they came to tell me he'd been hurt, I hesitated, just for a moment, but I hesitated. By the time I got there, he was gone." Stella's hand covered hers. "That wasn't your fault?" "Maybe not, but I won't make the same mistake twice. I won't let Colt slip away thinking he's alone." Sometime past midnight, his fever spiked higher. He thrashed against invisible flames, crying out words that made no sense. Ruth held him as best she could, her own tears falling unheeded. "Please," she whispered against his burning skin. "Please don't leave me. I know I have no right to ask. We've known each other such a short time, but I can't lose you. Not now. Not when we've finally found each other." "Doctor," Hawkins came again at dawn, his expression grim. "The next few hours will tell," he said. "Either the fever breaks or—" "It will break," Ruth said firmly. The doctor didn't argue, just left more medication and instructions she already knew by heart. The house fell quiet again except for Colt's labored breathing and the soft murmur of Ruth's voice as she continued her one-sided conversation. "I've been thinking about that table you made," she said, exhaustion making her ramble. "2 seats, equal height, no hierarchy. You said just 2 people sharing a meal. That's what I want. Colt, years and years of shared meals. Ordinary mornings with coffee and extraordinary evenings with laughter. Children, maybe, if we're blessed. A life, a real life together." She laid her head on the edge of his cot, still holding his hand. "I should have slept in your bed that night," she whispered, echoing his fevered words. "I should have understood sooner. You weren't asking for anything improper. You were asking not to be alone with your demons. And I left you burning by yourself because I was too concerned with appearances. Not your fault." The words were so faint she thought she'd imagined them. But when she raised her head, Colt's eyes were open, focused on her face despite the glaze of fever. "Colt!" She pressed her free hand to his forehead. Still hot, but was it her imagination or was he cooler than before? "You stayed." His voice was barely a whisper, but the wonder in it broke her heart. Of course I stayed. Where else would I be? Margaret left. I'm not Margaret. She squeezed his hand gently. I'm Ruth, and I'm stubborn as a mule when it comes to people I love. You're stuck with me. Colt Madsen. Better get used to it. A ghost of a smile crossed his cracked lips. Bossy. Yes, and you love it. Yes, he agreed. Eyes drifting closed again, but this time his sleep seemed peaceful, the restless thrashing replaced by genuine rest. By noon, the fever had broken. Doctor, Hawkins proclaimed it a miracle, though he gave credit to good nursing and Colt's own stubborn strength. Ruth didn't care what had caused it. She only cared that Colt was coherent, drinking broth, complaining about being confined to bed. The ranch, he fretted, the barn, the cattle, are all being handled. Ruth interrupted. Jake and the men have everything under control. Your only job is to get well. Still bossy. Still stubborn, she countered. Now drink your broth before it gets cold. He complied, though his hands shook too much to hold the spoon steady. Ruth took it from him without comment, feeding him with the same matter-of-fact care she'd shown throughout his illness. You told me things, he said between sips. About Thomas, about hesitating. Ruth's hand stilled. You remember that? Bits and pieces, like dreams, but more real. He caught her hand. You didn't fail him. Ruth, a moment's hesitation after years of disappointment doesn't make you responsible for his choices. I know that here. She touched her head. It's harder to know it here. She placed her free hand over her heart. I understand. I spent 3 years blaming myself for not being faster, stronger, better, for not saving Margaret from the fire and from herself. He was quiet a moment. But you were right about something. They made their choices. All we can do is choose differently. And what do you choose? Ruth asked softly. You, he said simply. If you'll have a scarred-up rancher who talks to ghosts and can't promise he won't wake up screaming sometimes. Only if you'll have a widow with a questionable past who runs toward burning barns and bosses injured men around. Sounds like a fair trade to me. They were quiet then, hands linked, hearts full of promises that didn't need words. Outside, Ruth could hear the sounds of construction, of life going on, of a ranch and a community rebuilding from disaster. I love you, Colt said, the words coming easier now, as if his brush with death had burned away the last of his reservations. I love you too, Ruth replied. And I'm going to keep loving you through nightmares and barn fires and whatever else life throws at us. That's a promise. No more sleeping alone, he asked. And she heard in the question all the loneliness of the past 3 years, all the fear of facing demons without help. No more sleeping alone, she confirmed. From now on, we face the fires together. He squeezed her hand weakly, but with clear intent, and Ruth knew that something fundamental had shifted. They'd both walked through flame, literal and figurative, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. More than that, they'd emerged together, forged by trial into something stronger than either could be alone. The road ahead would be long. Colt's recovery would take time. The ranch needed rebuilding. The town's gossips would have plenty to say about their relationship. But sitting there in the makeshift infirmary, watching the man she loved return to her inch by precious inch, Ruth found she wasn't afraid of any of it. They'd faced the worst and survived. Everything else was just life beautiful. Complicated, ordinary life, and they'd face it as they'd learned to face everything together. The morning sun painted Cross Hollow's main street in shades of gold and possibility. Ruth stood at the window of her shop, watching the early shoppers begin their day, when she noticed something new. A small sign in the window of the empty storefront across the street. Ruth's Stitch and Shelter, coming soon to expanded location. She blinked, certain she'd misread. But no, there it was, painted in neat letters on a wooden board. And standing beside it, trying to look casual despite the pleasure evident in his expression. Was Colt? Ruth stepped outside, not bothering with her shawl despite the cool morning air. "What have you done?" "Made a business investment," he said, his attempt at nonchalance undermined by the boyish grin tugging at his lips. "Garrett's been wanting to sell that space for months. Seemed ashamed to let it go to waste when certain successful businesswomen need room to expand." "Colt Madsen, you can't just—" "Can't I?" He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "It's already done. Signed and legal. Consider it a wedding present." The words hung in the air between them, momentous despite their casual delivery. They'd been dancing around the subject for weeks as Colt recovered, both knowing where they were headed but neither quite ready to voice it. That's generally something one discusses with one's intended bride. Ruth managed, her heart racing. "Is it?" He stepped closer, and she could see the vulnerability beneath his teasing. "Well then, Ruth Darnell, will you marry me? Will you take on a scarred rancher with a mortgage and too many cattle? Will you let me give you wedding presents before the wedding and generally make a fool of myself trying to show you how much you mean to me?" Ruth looked at this man who'd walked through fire, both literal and metaphorical, who'd offered her shelter when she had nowhere else to turn, who'd learned to sleep peacefully again because she stood guard against his demons. "Yes," she said simply, "though we're discussing all major purchases in the future." His laugh rang out across the quiet street, rich and full and free of shadows. He caught her up in his arms, spinning her around right there on Main Street, not caring who might see. "When?" he asked when he set her down, both of them breathless and grinning. "Soon," Ruth decided. "We've wasted enough time being afraid." The news spread through Cross Hollow like wildfire, though thankfully not the destructive kind. By noon, Ruth's shop was full of women offering congratulations and advice in equal measure. Even Mrs. Thornton made an appearance, her expression suggesting she'd swallowed something sour but was determined to be civil. "I suppose," the woman said stiffly, "that recent events have shown your true character. Colt Madsen is fortunate." It was as close to an apology as Ruth was likely to get, and she accepted it gracefully. "Thank you. Mrs. Thornton, your good wishes mean a great deal." Stella was more effusive, wrapping Ruth in a warm hug. About time Jake's been taking bets on when Colt would work up the nerve to ask. "And did Jake win?" Ruth asked, laughing. "Course he did. Man knows his boss better than anyone." Stella's expression softened. "You've been good for each other." "Anyone can see it." The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, some genuinely needing services, others simply curious about the woman who'd tamed Colt Madsen's grief. Ruth worked steadily, pinning hems and discussing the expanded shop's possibilities, all while fielding questions about wedding plans. "Simple," she said to anyone who asked, "just family and close friends." The fact that she had no family left and Colt's was long gone didn't need stating. They'd built their own family here, the ranch hands who'd become protective brothers, the townswomen who'd moved from suspicion to acceptance, the community that had rallied to help them rebuild after the fire. That evening, Ruth found Colt at the new shop space, sleeves rolled up as he measured and marked where shelving would go. The setting sun through the windows turned everything amber and warm. "You know I have opinions about how this should be arranged," she said from the doorway. "Counting on it," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Jake helped me with the initial measurements, but I figured you'd want to oversee the details." Ruth moved into the space, envisioning possibilities. "A larger cutting table there, shelving along that wall for fabric bolts, perhaps a sitting area here, where ladies can wait while I finish alterations." "Whatever you want." He straightened, studying her with those intense eyes that still made her breath catch. "I mean that, whatever you want to make this work. I want a workshop in back for teaching. Several women have asked if I'd show them the new stitching techniques I use." She moved to the back room, Colt following. Young girls especially. The Martinez family's daughter. Sarah, she has real talent but no way to develop it. Then we'll make sure she has a place to learn." He paused. "You said we." "Of course I did. Partnership. Remember equal seats at the table?" He caught her hand, pulled her close. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Only 3 times," she teased. "You're slipping." "Can't have that." He kissed her softly, then with growing warmth as she responded. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I love you, Ruth, for your kindness, your strength, your stubborn refusal to let me wallow in my grief, for seeing past the scars to the man underneath." "They're part of you," Ruth said, touching his face gently. "The scars, they're proof of what you survived, what you overcame. I wouldn't wish them away even if I could." He leaned into her touch, eyes closing briefly. Margaret hated them, hated what they represented, what they reminded her of every day. "I'm not Margaret," Ruth said firmly. "I'm the woman who loves every part of you, scars and nightmares and all. The same way you love me despite my past, despite the gossip, despite all the reasons a respectable rancher shouldn't marry a widow with debts and shadows." "Because of those things, not despite them," Colt corrected. "They made you who you are, strong, compassionate, willing to fight for a new life. How could I not love that?" A knock at the door interrupted them. Jake stood there, grinning broadly. "Sorry to interrupt, boss, but the minister's here. Says you asked him to stop by." Colt looked almost sheepish. "I may have been optimistic about your answer earlier." "Presumptuous, you mean," Ruth said, but she was smiling. Reverend Mills entered, a gentleman who'd served Cross Hollow for 20 years without succumbing to the judgment that plagued some religious leaders. "I understand congratulations are in order." "They are," Ruth confirmed. "Though we haven't discussed dates yet." "Actually," Colt said, producing another paper from his seemingly endless supply, "I took the liberty of checking the church calendar. 2 weeks from Sunday is available, if that suits." 2 weeks, Ruth's voice rose slightly. "That's hardly time to what? We don't need fancy clothes or elaborate plans. Just you, me, and the people who matter." His voice gentled. "Unless you want to wait, I'd understand if you need more time." Ruth looked at this man who'd planned their future while she was hemming skirts, who'd bought her a building and scheduled a minister and probably had a dozen other surprises waiting. A man who'd been so sure of her answer he'd risked looking foolish if she'd said no. 2 weeks, she agreed. "But I'm making my own dress." "Wouldn't have it any other way." The minister smiled, clearly pleased to be part of a love story that had captured the town's imagination. "I'll post the banns this Sunday. And may I say, it's good to see joy coming from sorrow. Your first wife would be glad, Mr. Madsen, to know you found happiness again." Something passed over Colt's face. Not the old pain, but a kind of peaceful acceptance. "I'd like to think so. Reverend, Margaret had a generous heart when the pain didn't overwhelm it." After the minister left, Ruth and Colt stood in the empty shop that would soon bustle with activity. Through the windows, they could see townspeople going about their evening routines, the ordinary life of Cross Hollow continuing around them. "Any regrets?" Colt asked softly. "This isn't the life you probably imagined when you answered my advertisement." "No," Ruth said thoughtfully. "It's better. I came here looking for shelter, for a place to hide from my past. Instead, I found a future. I found you." "We found each other," he corrected. "Two broken people who discovered that sometimes the cracks are where the light gets in." They left the shop hand in hand, walking through streets that had once whispered scandal but now offered nods of approval. At the ranch, the hands had clearly been celebrating empty bottles, and the remains of what looked like Jake's attempt at a cake littered the bunkhouse porch. "The boys are happy for you," Ruth observed. "They're happy for themselves," Colt said dryly. "Your cooking has spoiled them. They were terrified you might leave. Never, Ruth said firmly. This is home now. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed for one of the last times, Ruth thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain of Thomas's betrayal and death, the humiliation of being driven from Tucson, the fear of starting over with nothing but needle and thread and desperate hope. All of it had led her to Colt, to this place, to a future she couldn't have imagined in her darkest moments. Tomorrow she'd start her wedding dress. Tomorrow the real work of building their expanded business would begin. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and blessings. But tonight, she was simply grateful for second chances, for the courage to reach past fear toward love, for a man who saw her not as a scandalous widow, but as the partner he'd been waiting for. Through her window, she could see a light burning in the main house, Colt in the kitchen, probably unable to sleep from excitement rather than nightmares for once. Soon, she wouldn't have to wonder about his sleepless nights from a distance. Soon, they'd face those dark hours together, as they'd learned to face everything else. 2 weeks. It seemed both too long and not nearly long enough. But then, they had the rest of their lives to get it right. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruth was certain that would be exactly enough time. The spring evening was perfect, with stars beginning to pierce the deepening sky and a warm breeze carrying the scent of desert flowers. Ruth stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching Colt work in the garden he'd started near the kitchen window, the one filled with the hardy wildflowers she'd planted after the fire. 2 years had passed since their wedding. 2 years of building a life neither had dared imagine when they'd first met. The shop in town thrived, with 3 young women now learning the trade under Ruth's guidance. The ranch had recovered from the fire stronger than before, the new barn already weathered enough to look like it belonged. "You're going to wear a hole in that floorboard," Colt said, not looking up from his weeding. Ruth glanced down at where she'd been unconsciously shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Just thinking." "About," he stood, brushing dirt from his knees. The evening light caught the silver in his hair more than there'd been 2 years ago, but it suited him. "About beginnings," she said softly, "and endings, and how sometimes you can't tell which is which until later." He climbed the porch steps, concerned. "Ruth, what's brought this on?" She took his hand, placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "I suppose it's because we're about to start a new chapter." The comprehension that dawned on his face was beautiful to witness, surprise giving way to joy so pure it took her breath away. "You're certain?" "A doctor. Hawkins confirmed it this morning. Sometime around Christmas, he thinks." Colt pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. "A baby. Our baby." His voice was wondering, almost disbelieving. "You're happy?" She knew he was, could feel it in the way his whole body seemed to vibrate with emotion, but she needed to hear it. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her face. "Are you? I know we didn't plan." "The best things in my life have been unplanned," Ruth interrupted. "Finding your advertisement, coming here, falling in love with a stubborn rancher who slept in a tent rather than face his demons alone." They stood together in the gathering darkness, holding each other and this precious new secret between them. Eventually, Colt led her to the bench he'd built along the porch rail, settling her carefully as if she might break. "Stop that," she laughed. "I'm pregnant, not made of porcelain." "Let me fuss," he said, sitting beside her. "I haven't had anyone to fuss over in a very long time." The unspoken memory of Margaret hung between them for a moment, but without the old pain. They'd visited her grave together last month, laying flowers and making peace with the past. "I've been thinking about that first letter," Colt said suddenly. "The one I sent you. Do you still have it?" "Of course. Why?" "I want to read it again. Want to remember how it all started." Ruth fetched the letter from the small box where she kept her treasures, their wedding certificate, the first $1 earned from her shop, pressed flowers from her bouquet. She handed him the worn paper. watching as he unfolded it carefully. "Dear Mrs. Darnell," he read aloud, "your letter of inquiry has been received. The position remains open." He shook his head, smiling. So formal, so careful. If someone had told me then that in 2 years' time we'd be sitting here, married, expecting a child, you'd have thought them mad, Ruth finished. Madder than that, I'd have thought them cruel, offering hope where none existed. He refolded the letter, handed it back. I was so lost then. Ruth, sleeping outside because walls felt like coffins, jumping at shadows, convinced I'd spend the rest of my days alone with my ghosts. And now I sleep beside my wife in our bed, in our home. I wake from nightmares sometimes. Yes, but you're there, reminding me they're just dreams, that the fire is over, that I survived it. He took her hand, that we survived it. Ruth leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Remember that night you said, "Sleep in my bed tonight, or I'll sleep on fire alone"? You thought I was delirious. You were delirious, but you were also telling the truth, even if neither of us understood it then. She turned to face him. You were asking not to be alone with your pain, and I was too caught up in propriety and my own fears to understand. You understood when it mattered. Colt said, "When I was ready to hear it. You were there." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge fully. From the bunkhouse came the sound of Jake's harmonica, a peaceful melody that spoke of home and contentment. "What do you think?" Colt asked eventually. "Boy or girl?" "I don't care, as long as they're healthy." Ruth paused, then admitted, "Though I'd like a daughter, someone to pass on my skills to, the way I'm teaching the girls at the shop. A son would be good too, someone to help with the ranch when I'm old and gray." He chuckled. "Grayer than I already am." "We could have both," Ruth suggested. "This doesn't have to be our only child." An optimist. I married an optimist. But he was smiling as he said it. You married a realist who's learned that sometimes good things happen to people who've known sorrow, Ruth corrected. That happiness isn't something you have to earn through suffering. It's something you choose every day, despite the suffering. Wise words. He stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, it's getting cool, and you need your rest." "I'm not an invalid," she protested, even as she let him help her up. "No, but you're carrying our future," he said simply. "Let me take care of you both." Inside, the kitchen was warm and welcoming. Colt had long since moved from his cot to their bedroom, though he'd insisted on keeping the kitchen stove burning low through the night, a compromise between his need to feel safe and his desire to live normally. As Ruth prepared for bed, she found Colt in what had once been Margaret's sewing room, now transformed into a study. He was writing in the ledger where he kept ranch accounts, but she could see it wasn't numbers he was recording. "What are you writing?" He looked almost embarrassed. "A letter to our child. Thought I might tell them the story. How their mother came to a broken-down ranch to cook and clean and ended up mending more than clothes. How their father learned that some fires forge instead of destroy." Ruth moved behind him, reading over his shoulder. His handwriting was careful, precise, so different from that first rushed letter that had changed everything. "Your mother was brave enough to answer an advertisement from a stranger," she read aloud. "Your father was desperate enough to place it. Neither of us expected to find love. Both of us had been burned by life in different ways. But sometimes the broken pieces fit together to make something stronger than what came before." Colt finished, setting down his pen. "Too sentimental." "Perfect," Ruth said, kissing the top of his head. "Though you might want to mention that your father was stubborn as a mule and your mother had to practically force him to accept help." "And that your mother was bossy from day one and your father loved it," Colt countered, catching her hand. "The child should know the truth," Ruth agreed, laughing. Later, as they lay in their bed, in their home, no longer haunted by fires past, Ruth felt the profound rightness of this moment. Through the window, she could see stars and the distant glow of the bunkhouse where the hands were settling for the night. Somewhere in town, her shop waited for tomorrow's customers, and here, between them, new life grew. "No regrets?" Colt asked in the darkness, echoing his question from their engagement. "None," Ruth answered, as she had then. "You?" "Only that it took so long to find you." "We found each other when we were ready," Ruth said, "when we could see past our own pain to the possibility of something better. And now we have everything," she said simply. "A home, a family, a future. What more could we want?" Colt's hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "Nothing," he said. "Absolutely nothing." Outside, a coyote called in the distance, and the wind whispered through the desert flowers in the garden. Inside, two people who'd walked through fire lay peaceful in their bed, no longer sleeping alone, no longer afraid of the flames. They'd written their own story, these two survivors. Not the one they'd expected when a desperate man placed an advertisement and a desperate woman answered it. But something better, a story of healing, of courage, of love strong enough to rise from ashes. And in a few months' time, they'd add a new chapter, a child born not from sorrow but from joy, raised in a home where scars were honored, where second chances were celebrated, where love was chosen daily despite the risk of loss. "Sleep in my bed tonight," Colt whispered, the old words taking on new meaning. "Always," Ruth whispered back. "Always." Thank you all for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts about Ruth and Colt's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Hit that like button. And don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover these tales from the American frontier. Your support means the world and helps bring these historical romances to life for listeners everywhere.